Everyone hears Donald Trump pays zero in taxes. That's because the tax code is set up for real estate developers to pay zero taxes. The government's getting so aggressive, they've started to ask for these things called K-2s and K-3s, where they start to break out different items of your return and how it's allocated to you.
I wanted to see what it would take to do my own taxes. I realized how difficult and complicated it is for a small business to actually file taxes.
When you're building something, you know what you're building. When you're buying something, you don't know what you're buying. Most of real estate lives in the partnership tax world. That's usually a combination of LPs, limited partnerships, and LLCs. We just bought a piece of land in here in Idaho that had this 7-unit boutique motel on it. And we were looking to redevelop that into apartments because when we have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so we're multifamily people. Let's build apartments there. Easy, right? I'm part of a modular development team where we're building 205 multifamily units in Denver. And modular construction is really cool. You're saving a lot of time.
What does it actually take to raise a fund?
It takes knowing a lot of people with money at the end of the day.
Welcome to another episode of Real Estate Development Land to Legacy. James Bohan, you are a CPA, you are a real estate investor, you're a developer, you do all these things. Sounds amazing. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Eugene.
So tell me, how does being a CPA and being a real estate investor and developer work together?
You know, they actually go hand in such a great way. The real estate industry is one of the best ways to minimize your tax burden legally in this environment. Everyone hears Donald Trump pays zero in taxes. That's because the tax code is set up for real estate developers to pay zero taxes. You know, the real estate lobby in America is one of the biggest lobbies. And when you look at it from an economics perspective, when people buy homes, they're hitting almost every single sector of the economy. You know, they're paying the contractors, they're getting the consumer goods, they're buying a bunch of stuff on Amazon to fill their kitchen. New home purchases in real estate is one of the biggest driving factors in the economy. And that's why you see a lot of the tax code written to incentivize real estate development to help developers pay less tax.
Interesting. So what would be an example of paying less tax?
The biggest one that most people know about is depreciation. But what people don't know is the nuances regarding like debt. And oftentimes, if you have an asset and appreciates 100% in value, a lot of times the only way to capture that is to sell it. And then you pay capital gains taxes on it. With real estate, you're able to use non-recourse debt for your investors or recourse debt for yourself personally in order to get more basis in the asset. And once you have more basis in the asset with debt, you're able to pull the cash out tax-free. So this nuanced thing of qualified non-recourse debt has been a legacy in the tax code for decades that has really protected real estate investors to be able to use these leveraged losses to offset their taxable income.
Yeah, I have to share a story with this since our tax deadline just passed for the latest extensions for LLCs, right? I actually wanted to conduct an experiment this year. I've never done this before. I've been in this industry for over 20 years. I conducted an experiment. I wanted to see what it would take to do my own taxes, all of my LLC taxes. And I have a good friend who's been a tax advisor for a big family office. So she was helping me a lot and kind of answering questions. But I realized how difficult and complicated it is for a small business to actually file taxes. At one point, I got so angry because not only you need to know the actual tax code and all the intricacies of the subject matter, but then I found that I'm also fighting the tools. The little tax preparation software that I bought was just not adequate. And I'm like, I know what I want to see in the end, but I don't know how to get there. And I spent hours upon hours doing that. That was my little pitch recently to my friends and contacts to, if you want to invest in real estate, invest passively, because if you want to do it actively and want to DIY the whole thing, it is going to be complicated. Even if you can figure out the actual subject matter, doing the work is hard, but then when it comes to taxes, I used to be angry at my CPAs when they would charge me $5,000 for a simple, in my opinion, preparation tax prep. I'm like, what are you doing? Now I know.
Yeah, everything's I've always had like a couple investors in a building, and then you start to ask more questions. Oh, one of those investors is in China, and you got to deal with international tax issues. The software sucks all over the place. I pay $10,000 a year for Big Four level software, and even that stuff can still be frustrating in order to try to get it exactly the way we want it to look. But I haven't found anything better out there, and it's just kind of the least bad one out there, and it's still 10 grand a year. And it's wild. The tax law is always changing, and the forms start to change with them. Just over the past 5 years, with the Trump Tax Act, the TJCA, that came out. It allowed this new thing called the 199A deduction, which people call like the 20% pass-through deduction. That added a whole lot of more reporting onto the forms. Then they started to institute these things called K-2s and K-3s, where they want to start looking at different aspects of the business. So everyone more or less knows what a K-1 is. And if you don't, it's when you invest in a partnership. Instead of giving a W-2 or a 1099 to report your income, you get a K-1. Now the government's getting so aggressive, and I think this is part of an overarching strategy to get us into a global tax regime. They've started to ask for these things called K-2s and K-3s, where they start to break out different items of your return and how it's allocated to you. So, for example, if you're just getting a K-1, you'll see line 2 net rental loss after depreciation. Whereas now on these K-3s that investors get, they'll show their gross income, their depreciation, their interest expense, and list out everything separately, because these different items get taxed differently by the different international regimes out there. So when you have international investors, they want to start seeing a lot of this information, and it just makes the tax compliance burden 10 times worse, just with all the data points each one of these K-1s or tax returns pick up. It's almost impossible for even smart guys like you to figure out how to do it on your own.
Indeed. I was just thinking that, I grew up in a construction family. So whenever we think of, it's just the way I was raised, the way we think about a new building, a new project, the natural thing is to think about how we're going to build it. What structure is it going to have? What materials are we going to use? How specifically we're going to go about building it? I wonder, do you first analyze the structure of the business and the tax impacts and the economic impacts?
Uh, when you get into those kind of questions about materials to build, the first thing I think of is like a cost segregation study where you're actually looking like, hey, what are the components I'm putting into this building? And then what are their tax classifications over them? And how can I segregate these costs out to get advantaged tax depreciation on things that can be deemed personal property, which you can use bonus depreciation on, which you can write up to 60% of the asset purchase in 2024. The other thing I really like to look at with my clients is the overall organizational structure. It's like, how does your management company interrelate with the fund you're raising? And if you have another developer company over here, how does that interrelate to make sure you're paying as little in tax as possible? Because in the tax world, you have different tools. C Corps are what's most publicly traded stocks are. And then you get into S Corps, which are a type of C Corp, which gives you some pass through aspects, which are what partnerships are. So using these different kind of tools to figure out how to get our investors the best after tax strategy is what my favorite thing to do is analyze our client's position from the jump.
I think my biggest takeaway from the last few minutes is that it's so complicated that it's already over my head, that I definitely need to bring in a professional to advise me on the structuring. And it sounds like we need to, regardless, whenever we do a new project, it has to be in a new LLC, which most people are, I think, smart enough, experienced enough to know that they need that liability protection.
Mm.
But what else? You just mentioned S Corps and C Corps. Are these all the things that have to be created when you're working on a project?
No, C corps are very rarely used in real estate, to be honest, but it's just kind of one of the most original corporate structures out there. So that's why I start with that. And there's a lot of case law around the C corp industry. But most of real estate lives in the partnership tax world. That's usually a combination of LPs, limited partnerships, and LLCs out there.
And so You also mentioned passive income versus active. What is the difference there?
So this gets into a really detailed answer here. And so generally speaking, active income is what your income that you're actively participating in. The usual IRS metrics are over 500 hours. You're deemed to materially participate in something, and therefore it's called active income. And that's just a designation of what ordinary income can be. Ordinary income can be either active or passive. And so this idea of ordinary income is separate from other ideas of what people might colloquially call passive income, which is really investment income in the IRS's eyes. So your dividends, your bonds, your stocks, oh, that's passive income. Oh, it's passive. You're passive. I could use passive income to write off my passive losses. No, that's all investment income, right? So, like I said, you have your ordinary income, your rental income, you have dividends, you have interest income, you have capital gains. And so you think, oh, yeah, I have all this passive income from interest and dividends. But no, that's not the same as passive ordinary income. So when you're thinking about it with the IRS and taxes, don't think stocks and bonds and that kind of stuff is passive. That's investment income. Now, when you get into investing into businesses, which is where we talk about trades or businesses or activities, this is where the distinction between active and passive starts to come down because this is all the stuff that flows through the line one or line two of a K-1. And so if you're a passive investor, that's like you're investing in Eugene's deal, you're along for the ride, you don't have any say in the matter, so you're really passive in that way. And so your income that comes into you is deemed to be passive income, and you could only offset passive income with passive losses. And so for some people, that's great. Maybe they're retired, they're out of their business, they don't really have any active income, but they have a few investments. Maybe they're retired from their business, they sold it, they still get maybe an allocation of income, but they're not working there. One strategy that people don't talk about is, oh, how do I get everything to be active? The same thing could work if you're like, how can I make everything be passive? Because you get to the same result at the end of the day. And there's a lot of different nuances out there. There's designations within active called real estate professional, which is a whole awesome way for real estate entrepreneurs and developers to get all of their real estate portfolio as active. They just need to be an active material participant in what they're doing. And then anything that they invest in outside of their projects, they can bring that in under a grouping election to say, okay, this thing that might be passive for someone else, since I'm a real estate professional, I spend 2,000 hours a year doing real estate activities, reviewing leases, building stuff, but I threw 550K into my buddy's deal. That's considered active for me because I'm an active real estate professional. And so this is where kind of the idea of active passive comes in. And when people start thinking like passive income, they get trapped sometimes thinking about, oh, my stock and bond income is passive, so I'll just offset that with depreciation. But that doesn't always work.
What kind of properties do you invest in?
So traditionally, my family's been in multifamily. We have a few different random assets as well too, like a storage building, a multi-purpose one. We just bought a piece of land in here in Idaho that had this 7-unit boutique motel on it. And we were looking to redevelop that into apartments because when we have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so we're multifamily people. Let's build apartments there. Easy, right? This was a couple years ago. And for a lot of macroeconomic and microeconomic reasons, it didn't quite fit to blow this thing up and build apartments. So we just did a light value add reposition strategy. We added 3 more rooms, got an events permit, and started holding events out there. It's been a really cool experience for me to go through this process and understand how hospitality can be ran efficiently with AI these days, using door codes, having a seamless check-in process, communicating with your guests in advance, having on-site backup systems in case those fail. And it's been a really cool experience in the hospitality space, all while basically having a covered land play in an area we think is going to have significant appreciation over the long haul. In addition to that, I'm part of a modular development team where we're building 205 multifamily units in Denver. And modular construction is really cool. People have a lot of different misconceptions about it right now, where they think you can get a lot of money savings because you're building stuff in a factory and then placing it on site. But where it's at really today is you're saving a lot of time. And well, time is money in a lot of ways, and time is a huge component of IRR. So if you're able to deliver a project twice as fast, your IRR generally is going to be twice as good as the next deal. And as this industry gets more seasoned and experienced in the United States, I think we'll start to see those cost savings come down, especially when developers and factories can be deploying at scale.
Oh, interesting. So modular is something I've been fascinated with for a very long time. In fact, every time we do a new project, I look at whether modular would be a fit for it. And we've looked at different styles from panelized to different kinds of prefabricated structures to fully assembled modules, from wood frame modules to steel frame modules and everything that goes in between. So, what's your flavor?
My flavor right now is the prefabricated in a factory, whether it's wood or steel. It depends on the project and the type. If you're going above 5 stories, generally you need to go steel. But the main difference I've been telling people is that think about volumetric as that's what you're building in the factory. That's that steel wood building where you go out, you ship those things from the factory, go on a site, get a crane, and just stack them up like Legos. The panelization is a little different. I don't know how old our audience is here, but I remember playing with Connects as well as a kid. And those are things where you click them together and you build a wall out of Connects. And that's what panelization is to me. And so that's a more complicated and detailed process, I think, than just kind of building everything in a factory and stacking it like Legos and hooking up the MEP on site.
Yeah, and from what I know, different states have different regulations when it comes to modular prefab. I know here in Washington, it's one of the most conservative states from my research, where everything needed to be inspected by state inspectors at the factory while the building is or components are being built together. How does it work in the areas where you're developing?
That's a really good question. And so our site is in Denver, Colorado, but we're building in Boise, Idaho. And Colorado is sending inspectors out to the factory in Idaho to make sure everything is going to be up to their code. So states are starting to understand that this can be a way of the future, and they have developed programs out there to make sure that they're still meeting code and being compliant with having safe buildings.
How about transportation? A lot of times, our expensive transportation and expensive gas and all that makes modular prefab construction cost prohibitive. Have you found that, or have you found an easier solution for that?
No, not yet. Building factories local to where you're building is one thing I've heard people in the industry talk about. Like I've heard of people wanting to build modular in Puerto Rico, so they'll build a factory in Puerto Rico. If they want to build in Hawaii, they'll build a factory in Hawaii to produce the units there instead of shipping it across the ocean. But you touched on a really good point. That shipping cost with the freight of the trucks is why the cost savings isn't there for modular yet. And our estimation for our project it all evens out to being the same as a traditional just building it stick by stick.
What was your experience with permitting a modular building? Do municipalities, do they view it as something too foreign, too scary, and scrutinize it more, or are they warming up to this idea?
My partner Eduardo handled all the entitlements for this project, but I didn't hear any horror stories from him. You know, we originally came from California. We're dealing with potentially CEQA and like a million other different people who want to stick their nose into a project. And that didn't happen here. Everything seemed to be pretty smooth. I even think Colorado is putting some governmental money into supporting the modular industry. And we didn't really get too much resistance from the state. It wasn't the first time they'd done it or seen it, so that probably helped a lot. And I didn't really feel or hear any pushback from the bureaucrats at all.
That's excellent. How do you go about estimating the cost of the work, whether it's modular or not? When you're starting a new project, where do you get the numbers? How do you put the model together?
It's a really good question. There's a few ways to go about it. Some people have access to databases of current costs, and other people rely on relationships with their builders. If we're taking a first blush at something before we get under contract, we'll be, talking to our GCs and our team routinely and get an idea of like, okay, it's like $200, square foot hard cost, put that in pro forma. Okay, if the deal pencils at a good idea, let's get under contract and then let's go out and start to get formal bids on this thing. So it's like a back of the envelope, knowing the numbers we know that are real today to get something under contract. And then once we have it there and we're fully baking the cake, that's when we'll go out and do a more competitive bid process because it takes too long to do that on the front end and then you'll lose the deal if you're trying to like fully bake the cake before you even get the ingredients from the kitchen.
And with modular, not a lot of GCs, I would imagine, have experience and familiarity with it, right? How do you mitigate the risks or the unknowns that would happen on site?
So for us, we want to work with a GC who has that modular experience. With modular teams, if you're putting people together, oftentimes only one person will have that modular experience. And that can lead to risks to your project if the GC doesn't know what's what. The GC's role and scope also gets extremely limited in a modular project where they're mostly doing a lot of the horizontal work before you bring in kind of the stuff to go vertical. But they're also the guys overseeing all the MEP connections. So something really cool that our factory and most factories do to reduce risk is they'll fly out the GC and all the subs that are actually going to work on the project to look at a prototype module. And so they'll build one first and then fly everyone out. Be like, hey guys, look at this. Give us your feedback. Is this going to work? And then the subs on site are actually going to see it before in person before they see it on site to do their job and make sure everything goes right. So there's an extra quality control there to make sure everything's going to line up. And then so once they get on site, then all the subs are ready to go. So that's a really good point you brought up is like working with GCs. One of their extra jobs as well is to oversee that crane guy, dropping them in. And there's a lot of companies out there with that specialty. While the industry and this building technology is a little nascent in America, there are people with seasoned experience out there that we are working with.
You mentioned that it's much faster, that it saves a lot of time when you're building modular, but doesn't it still take time to build the building in the factory? And then you need to essentially take it apart, transport, and then erect it on site. Where's that time saving comes in?
The time saving has come is because these factories build it as an assembly line. It gets built faster in a factory because you can build multiple floors at once. When you're building just on the ground, you can't build the second floor until you built the first floor. So you're able to push stuff out at scale more quickly that way. And then also from an IRR basis, you're right. The project's going to be tied up for the more or less the same amount of time, but you're going to build it faster. And also your draws are going to come differently. So on an IRR basis, your money's coming in closer to when you're stabilizing, refinancing, or selling.
Okay, that makes sense. But then you mentioned one other thing that triggers a question, the draws. A lot of times, and I haven't built modular yet, but I've been researching it quite a bit. Forgive my questions. The financing aspect I found to be pretty interesting. A lot of the lenders that I've spoke in the past did not know how to handle modular because there was a lien priority issue, or how can they lien a product that's not physically on site if there's a problem with the borrower. And then also the factory requires payments to come in a lot of times upfront because they need to buy a lot of materials and they need to procure stuff. And so they require payments to be made early on, whereas many lenders require the product to be on-site inspected before they release the draw. How do you solve these two issues?
You work with lenders who are familiar with this space. You brought up a couple of good points, and that's just going to be deal killers for a lot of the financing options out there. And then apologize, I can't recall your first question. I want to make sure I answer both of them. What was it? First part of that
The
question?
liens. The liens. One of the lenders told me that they cannot put a lien on a product unless it's physically on site.
A lot of the people that are financing these projects are comfortable with that risk.
What my experience was is that typical commercial banks probably wouldn't be a good fit because they're still not set up for something unusual, unorthodox for them. But there's plenty of private lenders that are more comfortable, that are able to figure out ways around legal complications.
Yeah, and there's PACE financing available too, and so we're getting creative with our capital stack and how we're financing the deal and putting it together.
What's a PACE financing?
PACE financing is something that came about in the last 10 years or so, and it's a nationwide program that local counties and jurisdictions have to adopt to give financing at preferred rates, maybe, to developers who have clean energy buildings. And so the way PACE works, it's like mezz debt, but not. And it's serviced by the property tax department of each jurisdiction. So technically, these PACE financing sits senior to the senior lender. And not every lender is going to be okay with it. So, for example, let's say you get 60% LTC from Wells Fargo. Then you get a 20% LTC PACE financing. So you're, 80% leverage and you only have to bring in 20% debt. And that 20% PACE financing sits with the tax bill and rides out at the property level. And it's not really, it's that's how it's effectuated. It's a loan, but it's not the same as a bank loan.
It's recorded as a tax assessment, essentially.
Yeah.
And we found that some lenders are, again, not very comfortable with it because they view it as if the PACE lender has priority, lien priority in front of them, even though it technically isn't. And in case of foreclosure, that was the key, I think. In case of a default, the PACE note does not come due. So it can stay with the property and it could be sold.
Exactly.
And transferred on. So that was the biggest advantage, which even though technically speaking, they may appear to be above the senior lender, but they don't need to be paid out first in case of a default.
It's just the same as the property taxes. The U.S. government is the first lien holder against every real estate in this country, and that's why your lender has a property tax reserve. Make sure you're paying your property taxes because they don't want the property stolen by the government because they're going to lose their collateral, And so that's a really nuanced point you brought up. Whereas this thing does sit senior to the senior loan, just like property taxes do, but the amount that is senior to them is just the annual amount that's due every year. Once you pay that, then there's nothing senior until the next year, and the next property tax plus PACE cost accrues.
Yeah, it's I've seen a lot of ads for PACE loans, especially recently in the last couple of years with the rise in interest rates because they are treasury based with a slight markup, so they're less expensive than a lot of commercial loans, and they do allow for higher leverage, essentially.
Mm.
Going back to where we started, depreciation and tax advantages. I heard a lot about tax advantages and using depreciation on when somebody's purchasing an existing building. How does that work with new construction, new development, where the structure and the capital injection and the building sort of formation starts from zero to then finally you have a building? Does that change the way your tax advantages or disadvantages maybe work?
There are ways, yes. If you would like to know, talk to me. But as a general answer, it's pretty much the same from a net tax perspective. I'm just going to say when you're building your own thing, exactly what all your costs are, what's going to this, what's going to that. You might not need to hire another company to go in and actually do the cost segregation study because you're the developer and you have all your costs segregated to begin with. It's just one small difference when you're building something, you know what you're building. When you're buying something, you don't know what you're buying. And so that's why you need to get a specialist and figure out what exactly is the component of all these costs that I'm purchasing in this building.
Generally speaking, when you finance a new project, new development, so we covered PACE loans, we talked about senior lenders. Where do you get the equity? Is it all your own family investing, or do you work with outside investors? So where does the equity come from?
For me and my family right now, on the stuff we're doing in Idaho, that's just kind of private capital for us. Off this track record, off our first hospitality asset, we're looking to raise a fund in the next 6 to 12 months to go purchase some more assets in the mountain states. Might not be 100% hospitality, just because I'm looking at things like I might be looking at buying a motel somewhere at 62 Keys, but it might actually work better as a multifamily and doing like a little conversion that way. I don't want to go out and I want to be able to go out and target the best and highest use of assets I'm looking at without being constrained by certain asset type qualifications. For the Denver deal, we've been using some institutional capital. We're in a raise right now. And like I said, we're trying to find like the creative way to use the capital stack to finance the modular project.
So when you're saying raising a fund, I hear a lot of people talk about raising a fund and it sounds easy. I'm just going to go and raise a fund. What does it actually take to raise a fund?
It takes knowing a lot of people with money at the end of the day. But the nuanced step approach is you, depending on what scale, okay, we'll talk about from my scale. I hire an attorney. I'm going out, I'm drafting for me in this instance, I'm drafting what's called like a prospectus. It's basically like a term sheet of a PPM. So it's all the salient points without a full PPM baked out. And I'm trying to use this to garner interest as I'm going out and trying to tie up properties with my own cash. So my idea is tie up properties with my own cash. And then as soon as I kind of have a good idea of what's going to go into the fund, raise around these ideas of properties I'm going to bring into it. So one is getting that LLC or LP, we're using an LP in our case, paperwork together from a quality securities attorney and start going to market with that. I'm a member of Raise Masters. I think you are as well too, which has been a great group to kind of learn the nuanced processes around capital raising, turning this idea of an art into a science. And Hunter has been a great resource in learning how to do that.
Yeah, Raise Masters is definitely a great program to learn about that. Anything else you want to talk about, James?
As a CPA, there is something that I've been wanting to talk about with a lot of syndicators and real estate developers and fund managers out there, and that's getting your back office together. There's a study that was done like 20 years ago where they interviewed a bunch of hedge funds, and 50% of them failed because of back office issues, not because they were making bad investments. And so making sure your back office is competent and complete is really important. And it also shows that you're making an investment into protecting your investors' money. I see a lot of people out there that just like raising money, throwing in a bank account, and there's no oversight. There's really bad reporting, and clients are having a really hard time accurately assessing their financial position. And one thing I really want to stress to managers too is being able to report the fair value and their share of debt to their investors, because this will allow your clients and investors to complete an REO schedule. And now they look like a much more creditworthy person to a bank when they're going to try to get a loan. Most times, all my investors get is maybe like an asset manager. Hey, things doing great, 70%. We were at 70% when we bought it. Now we're at 90% occupancy. We're off to the races. It's like all qualitative reporting, but it's not quantitative reporting. When I come from the institutional space, we had monthly or quarterly NAV statements we'd send to our investors. And maybe that's more of a hedge fund thing, but in the real estate space, just like a schedule of REO, hey, here's our total asset value. Here's your percentage of it, after maybe the promote. Here's your share of the debt. And then here's what your fair market value is at the end of the day. I've heard maybe there's some security compliance reasons, maybe why you don't want to say NAV if you're an exempt reporting advisor. But being able to report the fair market value of what you own in your investment is really what investors need to complete their REO schedule. So this is something I've been talking to Tyler Lyons a lot at ASIM Capital about how to like kind of coach the industry up to deliver the information to the investors that they need to get a good picture of their financial position.
Good advice. Good advice. Excellent. James, if anybody wants to get a hold of you, interested in investing or working with you as a CPA, as an advisor, how do they reach you?
So I'm available at jb@stonehand.com. Once again, that's J like James, B like Bohan, at Stone like a rock, and Han like Han Solo. So jb@stonehand.com.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, Eugene. Real estate development, legacy.